I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Where are our prophets now? Where are those messages God chooses to communicate divine revelation through? In the past, the Creator has sent prophets like Abraham, Siddhartha, Jesus, Muhammad, and many more. Maybe our higher power has switched tactics since we reinterpret God's words as soon as the Creator's prophets leave us. Could it be that Spirit talks to each one of us individually and we haven't learned to listen? On Words of the Prophets, our modern prophets show us how to find the internal prophet that is the I Am, and we discuss the application of spiritual principles in all aspects of our lives. Love and light, everybody. I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Today, my guest on my far right is Hank Hughes, who is the Executive Director of the New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness. Welcome, Hank.
Hi, Phil.
As like I tell you every week, Hank and I go back a long time. He's been with me for almost in the beginning when I was on radio. You're getting tired of hearing that, aren't you? And we have a newcomer with us today. Sitting in between us is Anna Carvelan, who is the data manager of St. Elizabeth's Shelter and is the author of the book titled Dwell at My Door. And we're going to talk about homelessness today. So today's prophetic topic is equality and brotherhood must be established. And this phrase was extracted from an address on the teachings of Baha'u'llah, which is basically the prophet for the Baha'i faith, given by Abdul Baha to the Theosophical Society at their headquarters in London, England, on September 30th, 1911. And the statement it comes from reads as follows: Equality and brotherhood must be established among all members of mankind. This is according to justice. The general rights of mankind must be guarded and preserved. All men must be treated equally. This is inherent in the very nature of humanity. What we're going to be doing today is hopefully getting you involved. You know, all the shows we've done up until now, we've talked about a variety of different spiritual practices. And one of the things that each one of those spiritual practices had in common was about service to others, that we're here to help each other. And that's what today's show is about, getting involved, helping people. And, you know, there's not many people out there more in need than the homeless. So let's start. Hank, introduce yourself. Tell people your story. How did you get involved in this noble project?
Well, I'm currently the director of the New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness. Prior to that, I was director of St. Elizabeth's Shelter, where Anna now works. And so I've, over the years heard lots of stories of from homeless people staying at the shelter, which is why this book is a really interesting project from my perspective to actually set some of that down in writing. There's so many different experiences that homeless people have had, all of them interesting, a lot of them, as this book shows, pretty sad, pretty discouraging, and yet, people always have hope and are always working hard to try and better their lives. We formed the Coalition to End Homelessness in the year 2000 to be an advocacy group for the homeless, to advocate at the state legislature and the federal government and local governments, as well as to help our member agencies, which St. Elizabeth's Shelter is now a member of our coalition. We wanted to help our members do a better job, have access to all the latest thinking and access to as much money as we can make available.
And I think one of the things we're going to touch on is what is the latest thinking. But before we do that, and I want to read this. Anna's written a book, and she's going to talk about it. But I want to read the back cover and then I'll let her talk about it. With homelessness on the rise, it is more vital than ever for communities to engage in dialogue and generate solutions. First-hand accounts of those who are homeless or working to address homelessness add the human dimension that's missing from statistical reports, which tend to dominate and sometimes misguide public discourse. The 45 interviews in Dwell at My Door have one commonality. They are real experiences of people who are deeply affected by homelessness. Many of the stories are bittersweet and many are inspirational. All the stories will heighten readers' awareness and bring insight into the lives and struggles of the people who shared them. The people interviewed speak with sincerity and candor about the paths that led them to homelessness. Their input is an important contribution for solving this pressing social issue. And I like that because what you're doing is you're saying, forget the numbers, forget the statistics. These are human beings, and I'm going to add spiritual beings.
Right.
Talk about what motivated you to write this book, what it was like to write this book. Why are you at St. E's?
Well, it's ironic that, you know, I mean, my whole job is about statistics and the numbers and putting people into boxes, sort of. And so, and it's also more of a desk job, and whereas I had previously been working more one-on-one with people. So first of all, I really wanted to just do something where I was talking to people and getting to know them, and then and add that element to my job. And you know, so by doing this, I was getting a more in-depth understanding of these people that I was working with, but not working with so much, working for, sort of. And so that was the one thing. I also come from a family who writes a lot and is into books, and so, you know, and I have journalists in my family, so it kind of is a natural path for me to do a project like this. And yeah, so that was the first reason.
You know, I mean, and I've talked about this on the air and I've talked on the radio. I'm a recovering drug addict.
Mm-hmm.
So to find out that I was working in a treatment center is not a big leap. You know, you kind of tend to do that. What brought both of you to work with the homeless? And I know your story's in the book, but do you want to share a little bit about it?
Well, I think I had been concerned about homelessness ever since living in Philadelphia in the late 1970s and actually having to step over people on my way to work. And I kind of wondered, why are they there? Why in this country that seems to have plenty of stuff for everybody, why are there some people who are left out? And so I didn't act on it then, but later when my wife and I moved to Santa Fe and she got a job and I didn't need to work right away, I started volunteering at St. Elizabeth's Shelter. It had coincidentally just opened as we were moving to town, and so it gave me a chance to investigate that side of life, and I guess kind of got stuck there for a while because we still haven't solved the problem, and I still have that question as to why people are left out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a question that maybe we can get some people stimulated to help try to answer. And what got you to a homeless shelter?
Well, initially, I volunteered at the Catholic Worker in New York, and that was in college. And the reason I did that was because I had a family member, my mom, who had volunteered there years before. So I volunteered there for a month and lived there, and that really just opened my eyes to the situation. And so after I went to school, and then I went to the Peace Corps, and I worked with HIV AIDS education. I was doing HIV AIDS education. So when I came back to Chicago, I found there's an organization that housed people who were HIV positive and homeless. And so I worked there for a time, and I worked at different meal services programs in Chicago. And then I came back to Santa Fe because I'm from here originally, and some things brought me back, including a job at St. Elizabeth's Shelter. So that's been it up to now. So.
Do you miss being in the trenches, so to speak?
Yeah. So that's what I was saying about this book. Is, I mean, when I was at the meal service program, it was real one-on-one, and you got the immediate feedback, and you know, sort of the immediate thanks, and it was real active and busy, and you know, so, and I was getting to know people's stories, and that's what led me to realize that I wanted to put this down on paper. I had been talking to one guy who told me he would rather stay outside during the winter and he slept behind a Family Dollar. He would rather do that than go to one of the shelters in Chicago. And it just piqued my interest a lot, and I would talk to this guy a lot, and he was really nice. And he stayed out in the winters 4 years in a row in Chicago, which is not an easy thing to do. So
Gets pretty raw out there.
yeah, very.
So how long did it take you to compile 45 stories?
Well, I did the interviews in '08, so all of '08, 2008, and then I did all the editing and transcribing for pretty much for the past 8 months. So I just finished it like a month ago. So, but had I done it again, I would have done both at the same time, done some interviews and then transcribing, and because the editing is what really takes the time. So,
if there was one thing that you learned from all the interviews, what did you learn?
well, I don't know about one thing, but I mean, some of the interviews I read, I probably read each of them at least 20 times, if not more, just doing the editing. And some of them were just, I would cry just about every time I read them, or I would laugh, or whatever. I would be, I just really felt a connection with them, and probably because I had sat down with them, and so I remembered that exchange, and I remembered, kind of sensing the feeling there, and so, but yeah, I just really felt it was a good way to connect with people, and just putting their story on paper kind of, it validates a person's story, good or bad, right or wrong. It validates what it is. So.
Did you meet much resistance?
I had one guy who decided he didn't want me to do the interview. I had done the interview. He didn't want me to record it. He was the only person who didn't want me to record it. And so I was writing it all down. And then later he told me he didn't want to do it, but it was because he had just come back from Iraq, and he just didn't feel comfortable having a story out there. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, and we're going to give you some time to tell people how to get this book, but it's a beautiful read. It's touching. It's real. It is human. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and lie and say I read the whole book, but I read, I don't know, the 6 chapters, 6 categories. I read one story in each category, and they're beautiful. So we're talking about homelessness. Let's define it. What is homelessness? Either one of you.
Well, homelessness, there's actually a federal definition, and it's gotten more complicated over the years as it's been negotiated. But generally, homelessness means people who are living in places not meant for human habitation, or they're living in a shelter or a program for people who are homeless.
What does that mean, not fit for human habitation?
Well, it means you're living in your car, you're living outside, you're living in an abandoned building, under a bridge, in somebody's garage, maybe in the shed. Those kind of places. That's where a lot of people, end up when they have nowhere else to go.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that, Maurice, who's in the book and also worked at St. Elizabeth Shelter and Albuquerque Opportunity Center. He was on the board there. He talked about it. He also has suffered from PTSD from being in the Army, and he talked about it as, even if you're living somewhere, if you can get kicked out at any moment, you're homeless. If you're in a tenuous situation, or if you're just powerless in your situation, it doesn't matter if you have, a bed and a place to sleep and eat. If it's tenuous, it's,
And so a lot of families who are homeless are in that situation where they're staying with relatives, staying with friends who, don't want to see the kids out on the street, and yet it's like that if there's a fight or the person who owns the house gets tired of having them, then they're out.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody volunteers to be homeless, so to speak, is that really counted as homelessness?
Well, sure. And that's a question I get all the time. People say, well, don't a lot of people want to be homeless? And even, and I know that there are some in the book who talk about that. The people that I I talk to, you have to ask the next question, well, what was your other choice? You know, what was your other choice besides being homeless? And the other choice sometimes is living with an abusive parent. A lot of people start their homelessness career, if you want to call it that, when they're very young. And to them, sleeping outside, sleeping on their friends' couches is far preferable to staying with a parent who beats them up on a regular basis. You know?
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that's not an insignificant number of people. And so people say, well, yeah, I chose homelessness. I ran away from home. But it was not the kind of home that we're thinking of, that they ran away from.
I mean, I'm going to just share a little quick story here because I'm just curious. Because I left the East Coast 18 years ago. Sold my house, bought a van, outfitted it, traveled around the country living in my van. Does that qualify me as being homeless?
You know, it's hard to say, because I did, you know, interview somebody like that, and currently he is working. He's, you know, doing the 9-to-5 thing. He says yes, and it's actually he has a tattoo on his back that says home, so he feels at home wherever he goes. Is how he puts it, and you know, he just really didn't feel suited to being part of the structure that we're all supposed to fit into. And whether or not that's his fault, I mean, most of the time I would think not. Most, you know, people sometimes just don't fit in, and they can't find a place to fit in. So.
And I would say that, I mean, because my wife and I, you know, traveled around the country for a bit too after we graduated from college, and we didn't have a home. We lived in our car and our tent. But I think there's a difference between camping out for fun. It's when you get into that position and you can't get out. I mean, you can't get a job. You can't stop living in your car when it gets old and you're tired of it, and the car breaks down and doesn't run anymore, and it's parked on the side of the road, and it's still the only place you have to sleep.
I'm going to add to this little story, then we'll get on, because I think it's significant to what we're talking about. The woman who's now my wife and I were down in Key West, and we were living in the van, and we had a dog with us. And it was one morning I was walking the dog on the boardwalk. And she's a fairly big dog, and so she wanted to go somewhere, regardless if I was walking or she got there. And there was something about this one person sleeping on the bench that attracted her to all the other people sleeping on the bench, and she would never start looking this guy's face. And he gets up and, you know, plays with the dog. He was really nice about it. And we're talking, and he's telling me about, you know, he voluntarily was homeless. He was an executive in Wall Street and decided I didn't want it anymore. And, you know, just like he would travel what I guess was the circuit. In the winters, he would go south, and in the summers, he would head north. So after talking for a while, I just like, you know, ego gets in the way, and I was like, oh, hey, I'm homeless too. I'm living in a van. And he looked at me and smiled, and he pointed down to these beat-up sneakers he was wearing and goes, that's my van. And that was like a real dose of humility. But, you know, and that's why I was also asking, because, I mean, I didn't get into the whole details. You know, I don't know if at that point, because this was, like I said, 18 years ago, how much we knew about mental health and stuff, and whether he was suffering from something. But he made it sound like, you know what, I prefer this lifestyle. You know?
Right.
Well, and I think also, I think a lot of people base their experience of homelessness with a conversation with somebody on a park bench. And I think what's nice about Anna's book is that people trusted her enough to go a little deeper into their story. Because people usually, and we all do this, I'm sure we have our pat story that we tell the public about who we are, like I just told you about. Me, I didn't tell you anything bad about myself, and I think homeless people...
bad that you could possibly tell.
Well, that you know of. But, you know, if you ask my wife, she can tell the other side. But I think homeless people, too, you know, on the surface, they have one story, but I think Anna's been able to get at the deeper stories, which gives you a much deeper understanding of how someone who could be an executive in one part of their life and a homeless person in another part.
And then speaking of mental illness or any kind of illness, I mean, substance abuse and depression are kind of the two things that people aren't very ready to be compassionate about. It's like, get out of bed and go do something. You know, that's kind of most people's reaction about depression. It's like, just get up and do something. Or substance abuse, just stop it, you know. But until you're there, you just don't understand. So you just cannot point fingers. And I would just, you know, people can just take a step back, and if you don't understand it completely, just try to have compassion and just try to understand that people are suffering and, you know, sometimes just cannot get up on their own.
You know, and I've said this on a few shows, but compassion is a spiritual principle, and it's sorely lacking in this society and in this culture. And one of the things that we've talked about on some of the previous shows is that beautiful line in the gospel where Jesus says, love thy Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and body, and love thy neighbor as thyself. The problem with that beautiful statement is if I don't love myself, I can't love you. And I think, you know, what Hank was starting to talk about, you know, is like children getting abused don't learn how to love. Two things happen to abused children. They fear intimacy because it's going to hurt, and in order to avoid intimacy, they withdraw. And whether that withdrawal is isolation by locking themselves in their rooms, whether it's Game Boys, whether it's drugs, whatever that disassociative behavior is, we don't learn to connect to people, and we don't have empathy, and we don't have compassion, and we don't have mercy, we don't have any of that stuff.
Right.
Let's talk about, you talked about children. I want to talk about this for a bit. What is the makeup of homeless population, and how has it changed over the years?
Well, I think the makeup is really actually, it's like, even though Anna works on this all day long on statistics, and we talked about statistics, it's really hard to get an overall picture of homelessness, in part because when the federal government counts homeless people, they don't count those families that are doubled up, and so we're really undercounting, you know, on an official basis, the number of families who are homeless, which makes it hard to get at that number.
How do you count a migratory population who has no...
Well, they pick a day. They pick one day in January, and they try and get everybody in the United States to count everybody who they come into contact with, and they try and make sure that we don't double count. And, you know, that's how they came up with whatever the recent number was, 700,000 homeless people on one day. Although we know that there were probably hundreds of thousands, if not a million, other people who never came into contact with anybody that day and were also homeless.
I mean, if I'm hiding out in Santa Fe, whether I'm in the arroyos, whether I'm up in the mountains, in the forest, how do I get counted?
Yeah, you wouldn't if you didn't come down to go to lunch at the soup kitchen that day.
Yeah, so that's what the counting is. People either show up at the shelter or the soup kitchen or any of those services.
Or people actually go out and do a count, like go out to the streets, right? I mean,
yeah, in cities they do that.
In
New Mexico, we don't try and go into the mountains to find homeless people because we think that might be kind of a waste of time, since people would hide from us anyway.
So how does, over the course of, I mean, because I'm sure the economy has something to do with it, and the economy is like, I don't think it could get, well, it probably could get much worse, but I mean, it's probably as bad as I can remember it. And, you know, how has the makeup of homeless population changed over the course of the last dozen years, let's say?
Well, there's been two periods of increase. I mean, we had a recession in 2001, and there was a big increase there, and we've seen a big increase, although again, it's hard to quantify in the last couple of years as well. And I think the part that's troubling is we don't seem to actually recover from those increases very well. I mean, it goes up, and then the economy gets better, and it sort of slowly goes down, and then we have another recession, and it goes up again. And we still have, you know, this really sizable group of people who are homeless.
Right. And then also during the Reagan administration, he closed down some of the mental health institutions where people were staying long term, and you know, I guess there were good intentions, save some money and let people do whatever they want to do, and not keep people stuck in these institutions. But the downside of that was that there wasn't any anywhere for them to go, so they didn't offer any social services in place of that. So,
and the mental health system really still has not caught up
right,
to where it would need to be. Because the idea is if you move people out of these hospitals, which were kind of restraining and not very pleasant, there were supposed to be apartments and community services for people to move into, and we still don't have. We have some of that, but not enough. Not enough. And a lot of the people who need that kind of service are veterans who come back with disabilities of one kind or another, some of them mental, some of them physical, and we don't even have enough supportive housing for our veterans, which you would think would be the easy group to convince people that we should take care of.
Well, a couple of months ago, I did a show with a couple of guys from Veterans for Peace, and we talked about that every war since World War II, none of the promises to the returning veterans were ever kept about their welfare, their health. The services have been cut, and there are less places to go and longer waits to get help.
Yeah.
Go ahead, read to me.
Oh, I was going to read you a quote. So from the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, they say that conservatively 1 out of every 3 homeless men who are sleeping in a doorway, alley, or box in our cities and rural communities has put on a uniform and served this country. So I think what that says is that veterans are often chronically homeless. They're often homeless for long periods of time, versus the acute, they go seek services briefly. I mean, they tend to be the population who's really, would you agree with that? I mean, yeah. So.
They're so traumatized. How do you get back into being a functional member of society with that amount of trauma?
Right, and they may be, as you might imagine, that's probably the same kid who ran away from his abusive family. So he was already traumatized before he went in the Army, and
joined the Army, and
if he's in a war, it would get worse.
Yeah.
Sometimes, but then you hear just anecdotally. I mean, just they're going with good intentions. They want to serve their country, and then they just really suffer and fall down.
Country uses them up and spits them out and throws them away, which I have a problem with. I'm not going to get into it today. I might. I still might.
I think we all have a problem with that.
I know. I mean, really, this is outrageous. Let me just go back on the makeup of homeless population. You mentioned children. Are there a lot of children that are homeless?
Sure, and that would be 2 categories, I guess. Those that are homeless along with their parents, which is usually people under 12, and those that are homeless without their parents, which are youth homeless people, which are usually older than 12. Usually around 12 or 13 is where people, if they've given up on their parents, they just leave. And they're big enough to do that. And so there's a whole group in Santa Fe devoted to that, and there's several around the state. Here in Santa Fe, Youth Shelters and Family Services serves that group of people who are children who are not with their parents and are, anywhere up to 24 years old sometimes.
So that's a separate What happens at the shelter when a family shows up, and so there's, I'm assuming there's more families showing up.
Yeah, again, it's kind of hard to say because we do try to count who we turn away, but sometimes that just doesn't get counted. So we have room for basically a family, and so if other families are seeking a place to stay and we have to turn them away, that might not get counted. So although we try to track that, it's not always easy to do.
So if a family is seeking shelter, it could be difficult to keep the family unit together in a shelter.
Yeah, like in an emergency situation, like our 30-day program, there's just limited space. I mean, so I'm not sure what case managers who they refer them to in Santa Fe, but
Well, in St. Elizabeth, you have the transitional living for families
Right,
too, which is
right.
8 apartments.
which are more long term. So then, if they're around long enough to get that service, and there's space available, then there's
And that's
8
probably
apartments.
the key, space available.
Right, that's always,
If you got
yeah,
8 units, I could imagine there's probably more than 8
Right.
families who are out there.
right.
Yeah, I mean, any of these programs, wherever they're built and opened, I mean, they fill immediately.
Well, I remember when Casa Cerrillos was opened. Remember Walter?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, Walter and I were good friends when he was.
Right. Right, he was a case manager
Yeah.
at St. Elizabeth's who was very excited about helping us open that program for supportive housing so people could live in their own apartments.
And the day after it opened, he moved to South Carolina.
Well, it was about a month after that. Yeah.
Well, now we have Shay over there who's in the book, and she has quite a story. And I mean, I think that's, I interviewed 3 people that actually work at St. Elizabeth. So, and people that have been around a long time and have been working with this. Deborah, who's the director, Shay, who's the director at Casa C, and Maria, who's the program manager at the emergency shelter. So she's been there for 23 years now. So I think their stories are some of the best, and they also offer their personal story, that gives some insight as to how they got on the path of wanting to work with homelessness.
Last time you and I talked, Hank, it was maybe a couple of years ago, we had short-term versus long-term homelessness. Is that still something that is relevant, or is more and more long-term and minimal amount of short-term?
No, I think there's still that division. In fact, there's an official definition now of chronic homelessness, which is the long-term people. And under the Bush administration, HUD's effort was really to concentrate on those people more than the short-termers. A lot of us argued that if you want to keep the short-termers from becoming long-termers, you can't not pay attention to them too. And so I think there's evidence that with the current federal administration that there'll be attention paid to all these people. But yeah, there is definitely, there's kind of the person who's situationally homeless because they lost their job, but they still have their skills, let's say. And so they'll get another job and they won't be homeless for very long. And the longer term homeless people are people who, have the disabilities, the mental health issues and that kind of thing, who really are not going to be able to compete for a job, no matter how many jobs there were in the economy. People with that many problems probably aren't going to get hired. And so.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about I think we've touched on, but let's put them together in a cohesive kind of, what causes homelessness? What are the causes? We talked about substance abuse, we talked about mental illness, we've talked about economics.
Well, I think the best answer I ever heard to that, because there's obviously a lot of factors that go into it, but really the other thing that the Reagan administration did was drastically cut support for public housing. And so, at the time Reagan became president around 1980, there was just about enough public housing and affordable housing for people. And now there's nowhere near enough. And the budget for housing is, I don't even remember, but it's, if it had kept up with inflation, it would be more than twice what it is now. And so we're really underfunding our housing programs. And at the same time, housing continues to get more expensive. And largely that is because of a couple things that are good for our community: zoning laws, building codes, things that make housing more safe, prettier, make neighborhoods more fun to live in. But all these things drive up the cost of housing. And so people, people just can't afford housing unless they have a good job.
We talk about affordable housing here in Santa Fe. I mean, I don't want to sound sarcastic, but isn't that a contradiction in terms?
Well, It's kind of hard to say. I mean, it's one of the women in here said, you know, she could get a studio apartment for $600, and that was fairly reasonable in Santa Fe. And I think compared to big cities or other cities, it's reasonable. You know, I guess it's all relative, but yeah, I mean, we don't have enough subsidized housing.
I mean, over the last, 5 or 6 years, to me it appears a large percentage of the apartments became co-ops or condominiums.
Yeah.
I mean, that had to have an impact.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it makes it easier to buy a condo because they're more affordable. But then
If you have money that you can afford to do it.
right,
Yeah.
Well,
right, but it makes the apartments, situation
Yeah.
much tougher.
I mean, the situation, I was in Chicago, so I knew the situation there. They had, Section 8 housing or affordable housing all around downtown. And basically, developers were going to come in, raise that, and build condos. And basically what people were going to get was a voucher to go live somewhere else. Somewhere else meant Harvey, which, if anyone knows Chicago, Harvey is one of the poorest communities in Illinois, if not in the country. And so people were going from one warehousing situation to another, basically. Once that property became important for investors to have, then it was just push everybody out, give a few vouchers to those people that were already there, and they can stay in that area. But everybody else go way, way south into an area where the economy is nothing, and
No access to jobs.
Yeah. So that's how the cycle continues.
Yeah, I mean, we unfortunately, and I don't think everybody realizes this yet, but we're to the point where people on the lower end of the income scale really cannot live in housing unless it's subsidized one way or another. Mm-hmm. Housing has gotten so expensive.
Mm-hmm. And then I was, people they want to do well. They want to work and do well, but it's just like when the minimum wage isn't keeping up, although in Santa Fe, we've done a good job with that. But, when people are working 12, 15-hour days just to make the rent, that is demoralizing. And that is a really good way to get depressed. And that's a really good way to, I don't know, it's just a really good way to fall out, fall out of caring anymore. If you don't feel like your society is caring about you when you're putting so much in, that's...
How long has the minimum wage been unchanged? Not including cents, what, 5.25 still?
I think it did just go up.
I think it went up recently, yeah.
So but it was
Significantly?
years.
But not significantly, not to what it needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, that's been,
many
how long
years.
has that been? Do you have
Over 10, but I'm sure it was
Yeah,
more.
well, and I think this statistic is still true, that the minimum wage has not kept up with the 1960s minimum wage in terms of inflation.
inflation?
So we aren't even, back to where we were.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it seems to be there are, how do I want to put this? Personal issues that people wind up homeless, but there's also a huge systemic component.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole thing now with the healthcare debate, the chapter on health is wealth, some people in there, you can just see, if services were available to them at not an exorbitant fee, then they could get other things in their life in order. And our whole healthcare system is just, it's not supporting people the way it needs to. So.
Yeah, managed care is a contradiction in terms. I was working here in Santa Fe. We used to have it was 2 facilities. It was a adolescent treatment center.
Mm-hmm.
We had a mixed gender facility and we had an all-male facility. There were 2 buildings. We were an 8 to 10 month program for what was then level 2, which was substance dependence or substance abuse. managed care came to New Mexico, our program went from 8 to 10 months to 2 to 3 weeks. It went from level 2 to level 3, which is mental health. And there were like 600 plus beds in the state, and that dropped down to like 80 beds like that. I was like, nobody cared.
Right.
They're looking for, and you mentioned Reagan, and I lay all of this on right in his lap. That whole concept of, is it cost effective?
Right.
How do we measure the cost effectiveness of a human life?
Right.
Yeah, I think we need to look at it more like from a moral, spiritual
Yes.
perspective, that if our society creates extra wealth, which we know it does, what's the best way to spend that? Should we spend it to give everybody a minimal set of services, including health care and housing, or is it more important for the people at the top to have 7 or 8 houses that they can go to whenever they feel like flying their jet there?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is totally outrageous.
We're kind of striving toward something that is really just a figment of the imagination, which is money, and the real things that matter, which is people's health and community and all that. The stuff that makes life good. That's not where we're putting our energies. We're putting it into this, money, which is something that we came up with.
And there hasn't been a politician in the last probably dozen years who hasn't run on a platform, I'm going to cut taxes.
Right.
I think I saw that in the paper the other day. Somebody said, wait, was it you who said that? Somebody was, maybe who was Ruth Hoffman, who said, wait a second, we got to look at this again. We can't just keep cutting taxes. I mean, the quality of life is suffering. I have a few bucks in my pocket. And the quality of life is just like, the parts have become greater than the whole. Totally unspiritual.
And then people that don't want to support social service programs, I think they should come to St. Elizabeth Shelter for a week and just talk to people who come in who, time after time, even though they're completely unable to get a job for whatever physical or whatever reason, they are rejected by Social Security disability, and they have to apply and apply again. And then once they get on Social Security disability, they're not even able to live on that amount. So the income that they do get is just very, very small, and and I just heard on the news that they're not gonna go up with the cost of living, because right now the economy is bad, so things are cheaper, even though people spend their money on healthcare, which is rising in cost, and so it's just a really flawed system.
I agree. So let's try to get into, we've covered all the aspects of why, where, and how. What's the solutions? I mean, we've been touching on them, but let's go pie in the sky and let's go practicality.
Well, and it's not like the solutions don't already exist. I mean, there's some really good examples, Casa Cerrillos and Sonrisa, that St. Elizabeth Shelter operates, are longer-term housing programs. And so these programs have been shown to work really well. When you let people have housing for long enough that they can start working on getting their lives back together, then lo and behold, they do work on that. And it takes more than the 30 days they can get at an emergency shelter, but it doesn't necessarily take forever.
Yeah, but I will say a lot of people that I interviewed for Dwell at My Door did say that St. Elizabeth's was one of the best, if not the best, shelter that they had been to. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that, given that Santa Fe is a smaller community than some really overcrowded urban settings. But also, I mean, the whole hand up, not hand out sort of philosophy, I think, is what we're aiming toward. And so we really do try to walk people through the steps to get somewhere, rather than just have them crash for 30 days and be on your way. So.
Last time you and I talked when we were on the air, I think actually Deborah, was with us at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I remember you talking about setting up a building to house homeless and have all services on site. And I think you were talking with the mayor at the time about making that happen. How are we doing with that?
Well, that has been stalled a little bit. Our hope for that was to use the state's capital outlay program, where they will basically build public buildings. That fund is very dependent on oil and gas revenues, which are down right now. So we've been talking to the city about some other ideas. that idea was for a one-stop service center more than housing.
Yeah.
The housing pieces are still moving ahead. The youth shelter is building some new transitional housing, longer-term housing for youth. Santa Fe Community Housing Trust is building an apartment building that'll have 15 units set aside for homeless people. So, and in the stimulus money, there is some money that can be used to buy foreclosed homes, and then we're going to use some of those for supportive housing, that kind of
Provided
thing.
they let you in the neighborhood.
Well, one of the tricks that I don't know if I should say on television is that if you're not changing the use of a building, then the neighbors don't really have anything to say.
There's somebody who wanted to open up that halfway house for recovering addicts over on Richards or in that area by Cerritos, and some politician lives in the neighborhood, and they got the whole thing kicked out and turned down.
Well, that's because there was a change there was a zoning change or a special use permit required or something. If we just buy a house
and put a family in it
and rent it to a family that happened to be homeless,
then there's no change.
There's no change.
Yeah.
Good to hear. We got some time left. We hopefully have lots of people here who are listening, who we've touched and moved them. How can they help you?
Well, I should mention that all of the proceeds for all the sales for Dwell at My Door go to St. Elizabeth Shelter. Of course, you can make a donation directly to St. Elizabeth Shelter. But I think, reading this book might give you some insight into Santa Fe's specific situation about homelessness. So you can go to dwellatmydoor.com to get information for that. So.
I mean, let me ask you, made the comment. Do we need money? Do we need bodies? Where does the solution?
Well, I think we have to, I guess what I'd like people, if they're really interested in this, to realize first that charity is not going to get us the whole way there. Certainly we should all donate to St. Elizabeth Shelter. I even though I don't work there anymore, I try to donate to St. Elizabeth Shelter and some of the other programs that assist the homeless. But donations only cover a little bit of what it's going to take. The federal government and the state government are the ones that really have big money. And how they choose to spend it, it's basically our money. We have to remember it's our money. And if they decide that it's not going to go to housing and it's not going to go to health care, it's going to go to tax cuts for the wealthy and new toys for the Pentagon, then we're going to continue to have these problems. We really need to convince our legislators that we really care about housing and we really care about housing people. And
So then what we're looking for is outpouring of outrage to elected officials that this is no longer an acceptable situation.
right.
Okay. We have a little bit of time left. Let's give out some contact information, how to reach you, how to get the book, how to get involved. Maybe you want to give out some contact information for some legislatures. Ruth used to do that. That was beautiful.
Well, I don't have the contact information for the legislators in my head. The New Mexico legislature is going to be in session, a special session, I think, in October. And you can go to the legislature's website and get the phone numbers for each individual legislator, as well as, and usually their home number too, which is the best one to call them at because they don't spend that much time at the office. But there'll certainly be an opportunity at that point to encourage the legislators that if we need to raise taxes a little bit to keep programs for the poor in place, that we would prefer that to slashing services for the poor, which is what they're actually considering now, is slashing the Medicaid program, which is the health care program for the poor.
And then when you just lay it out in economic terms, it just makes sense to fund those programs so that you're not ending up where people need an emergency situation, which is what we're seeing in the healthcare system. People end up accessing emergency services for things that could have been taken care of a lot less expensively. So this is, you know, the same. But yeah, and then as far as getting this, as I said, you can go to dwellatmydoor.com. And you can get it on Amazon. If you get it on CreateSpace, the 2 links are there on the website. If you get it on CreateSpace, Sanies gets double the royalties. So, and yeah, if you have any questions, you can email me at anna@dwellatmydoor.com. So.
I wanted to ask you about that. What is the title? Why Dwell at My Door?
Well, I found a lovely poem by Rumi, and he talks about his lover who really is God for him, and he talks about, you know, humility, and he talks about serving, and that there's a lot of power in serving, and so anyway, I like Rumi, and I just thought it sounded good. So
excellent.
Yeah.
So give them contact one more time.
So dwellatmydoor.com. You can email me at anna@dwellatmydoor.com, or you can just call St. Elizabeth Shelter at 982-6611 and ask for Anna.
And for our organization, we have a website, which is www.nmceh.org. Or you can just Google New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness.
And they can reach you through that. So if anybody wants to question or wants to get involved, that's how they can do it.
Right.
I just want to mention just how I put this together was that I interviewed people and I recorded it and transcribed it. So it was important to me to keep their words. And I mean, of course, I changed as much, you know, I tried to keep as much as I could. So it really is their words, and of course I edited it, and that was really important to me because I think these people tend to be people that don't have a voice, so it was important to me to keep that. So, you know, I think I've enjoyed reading it. I've gotten compliments and I've had some good feedback, so I hope people can enjoy it.
I hope so too. It's a marvelous book, and it's going to open the eyes of anybody who reads it. And that's what we need to do, is open our eyes, and then when our eyes open, maybe our hearts will open. Let me just make a couple of quick announcements here, and then we'll ask you both to come up with collectively or individually a parting thought. Anybody wants to contact me, my contact information will be scrolling at the end of the show. There's a phone number, an email address, and a website. If you want to get a hold of me, you got any questions, feel free to contact me. Be happy to have some kind of dialogue with you. I am also a spiritual counselor. I use spirituality in the healing process. I don't believe in the therapeutic model as it currently exists. No offense. So if you think that I might be able to help you, call me. We set up an appointment. We could sit and talk. My services are on a donation basis. Next week, we're going to follow the same train of thought. We're going to have Dr. Yolanda Briscoe, who's the Executive Clinical Director at the Santa Fe Recovery Center, and Julie Roberts, not Julia Roberts, but Julie Roberts, who is the Acting Director of the Drug Policy Alliance in New Mexico. And we're going to talk about why that system isn't working. Why do we still have people, who are acting out under the influence? And what we can do about that and why the system of dealing with them is definitely not working, and that's part of why they wind up at the shelter at some point. So tune in next week for that. And parting thoughts. One, both, either?
Well, I was thinking, I think we talked a lot about the problems, and having worked with homeless people for 20 years, I think it's important to note that a lot of people do get out of homelessness. I see people around town who were clients at the shelter when I was there, and now they're doing fine. So it's not all depressing, and I know the stories in here are not all depressing, because some people show incredible strength and resilience and do come back from being homeless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just say that support your local, I guess would be Santa Fe, so St. Elizabeth Shelter, and your local organizations that are helping people. And I felt autumn in the air today, so winter's not too far ahead. And one of the things that the shelter needs a lot is sleeping bags and stuff like that to keep people warm.
Blankets, sleeping bags, winter coats.
Right.
So they can just
Especially
drop
for
them
men.
off at the shelter, right?
Mhm.
You want to let people know where the shelter is?
It's at 804 Alarid Street, and it's across from La Chosa Restaurant, from their parking lot. And a lot of people don't even know it's there because it is a nice building. It's a really pretty building. So yeah, you can just drop it off right there.
And if you need directions, phone number one more time.
982-6611.
982-6611. Get involved. Okay, I thank you both. Until we have no more homeless, the show is always open to you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That's my pledge, because this is not acceptable. You use the term resilient. Mm-hmm. We are spiritual beings. Resilience comes with being a spiritual being, but sometimes it needs a little bit of nurturing. You can't just drop a seed in the ground, and if you don't water it, and if you don't, give it that nurturing, it's not going to grow. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to get preachy. I'm trying not to. I think I did a pretty good job, actually, of not getting too preachy. Hank will tell you I can get really preachy at times. But, we are a society, and the parts are never greater than the whole. And there is not a religion, there is not a faith, there is not a spiritual practice that does not honor the individual and says it's our job to take care of it. Do you know that in the Quran there are 99 descriptives of Allah, and the highest, the most important descriptive, or the attribute, if you want to use that phrase, is mercy. That is the most highest thing that we could ever do, is mercy. I think you can call that unconditional love. You can call it a lot of different things. There are people who need us, and we need to do something about it. We can't just just close our eyes and say, they brought it on themselves. No. This is a culture. They are giving us an opportunity to reach into our heart and be merciful. Please take advantage of that. Help the people in any way you can. Not everybody's meant to be on the line handing out food. Make donations, bring in clothes, there's always something you can do. Call these people, contact these people who have been my guests today, Hank and Anna. They'll help you, guide you to what you can do. So please, get involved, do something. Honor the spirit that's walking down the street next to you, and just doesn't matter whether they have a home or not, just be nice to them and see how you can make their life a little bit easier. So until next week, thank you, and I hope I didn't preach too much to you. Know that you are God. Walk in love and light. Blessings. I'm Reverend Phil, and I've been your host for Words of the Prophets. Thank you for tuning in. Please join me again next week, same time, same channel, for more Words of the Prophets.